Welcome back to the Irish Tennis Updates podcast. My name is Adam, your host, and welcome to a new mini-series all about the history of Irish tennis. This is episode 1. For this series, I've been speaking to Tom Higgins, author of the book The History of Irish Tennis a number of years ago. If you haven't heard of the book, it is 3 volumes. It covers everything about the history of Irish tennis. It is a really amazing book. And I was really excited to talk to Tom for these episodes. He is definitely the official expert on all things the history of Irish tennis. This episode, we are discussing the very origins of tennis as a sport and lawn tennis, how the sport came to Ireland, and the opening edition of the Irish Championships, which later became the Irish Open, and why they were such a success when they were first held. Just before we get into this first episode, I will mention that Tom's book is available to buy. You can send Tom an email at higgins.tom@itsligo.ie. I will also leave that email address in the description. So if you'd be interested in buying this 3-volume, 1,800-page book, then just send Tom an email. The book costs €50 and can be shipped to anywhere in Ireland, so do get in touch with Tom. And now let's get into our first episode, and we started things off with a question from former Fed Cup player and captain Yvonne Doyle about Tom's inspiration for writing the book. Here we go.
Hi Tom, it's Yvonne Doyle here. I just wanted to ask you what your motivation and your inspiration was to write the book, The History of Irish Tennis. It was such a huge task to take on and some achievement. So yeah, I was just wondering what inspired you and what motivated you.
I grew up in Longford, and one of 8 children, and we all played different sports, but tennis was a common one because we lived very near the tennis club in Longford, where they had 5 grass courts, and from about the age of 8 or 9 we'd all started playing the game there. That's a long time ago. And later on, I would have played in secondary school, and then at Galway when I went to college, and then in various clubs such as Glasnevin for a year, and then Ashbourne. And then eventually we ended up living here in Sligo, and 1978 was the year the club started here. And then I got really involved in it in terms of organisation and playing and coaching and so on. And after 21 years, I was going to put a little book together for Sligo Tennis Club. And I heard Jimmy McGee, who's he's not with us anymore, Jimmy, the famous sports brain. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but a lot of people would. And on a particular, I can remember to this day, on a particular day on the radio, and it was October or November, he mentioned that Barry McGuigan wasn't the only famous sports person from Clones and Monaghan. And he mentioned a fellow called Jim Park, or James Cecil Park. And I went and looked him up. And this fellow, James Cecil Park, was a phenomenal tennis player. Now, I won't go into all the details today, but he was phenomenal. But he's in the Guinness Book of Tennis Records as being the best all-round sportsman in the world who was a tennis player. And that was the day I decided I'm going to do more than just Sligo tennis. I'm going to do the whole country. Yeah. And 8 years later, I got the book finished, all 3 volumes of it.
That's great. And as you say, it's a huge 3 volumes, like an awfully large amount of content in it. Were there moments when you were writing it that, it seemed like there was too much and it was almost like a challenge to you? And how did you maybe overcome those, if there were those kind of moments that you had?
I'll tell you what actually happened was that the thing evolved. Initially, it was going to be a relatively short book of maybe 300 pages or 400 pages. And then more and more material came to me, literally from all over the world, from Australia, from Texas, New York, about Irish tennis people and their connections. And then more and more I found about clubs that were around that I hadn't heard about. And there was a gradual network of information coming from all sides, and same with photographs and data. And I said, look, this is a once-off, so I'm going to include as much as I can. And we ended up with 1,800 pages later. I had to finish it, even though obviously there would be flaws in it and material not in it that subsequently I found out about. But it was an attempt to put everything on Irish tennis into one volume, or well, 3 volumes as it turned out.
Yes, I think it's obviously an amazing thing to have such a good resource. But to jump in now to some of the history of Irish tennis, the content that we're going to be discussing a bit. I guess the first question I have is, when did tennis first arrive in Ireland, if you go all the way back?
Now, to answer that one, we could go back and look at how all the racket sports evolved, because there is a connection. I'm talking about games involving balls and shuttlecocks, and I've identified 40 or 50 different sports that all had their origins in games that were played in streets or in monasteries in France or in Italy. And then eventually a game called tennis arrived. And tennis was actually an indoor game. They played across a net with funny shaped rackets, funny shaped walls, and it was all to do with a sport. And one side of the court was longer than the other. It was called real tennis or royal tennis. And real tennis literally is still around in Australia and America, in England. Real tennis did take off in Ireland, and the Trinity College in Dublin, one of the earlier sources of our sports, they had a real tennis court in 1741. Now, the oldest one that's been recorded is back in the year 1298 in Valencia in Spain. The gentlemen of Valencia played it. Never mind the monks in France and in Italy. So that game took off, and it became a sort of a big thing among the royal houses of Europe. And all these courts were built, expensive courts, because the nature of them, and each one of them had unique features. And in Ireland in particular, there was a famous one built in the 1880s, I think it was 1880s, by a member of the Guinness family. And this was built off Earlsfort Terrace in Dublin. And it held the World Professional Championships for real tennis there in 1890, I think, approximately. Now, that was real tennis. Now, in parallel to that, there was a sport called rackets, which is nearly the originator of squash. And then there was badminton. And badminton was popular, goes way back as well, but one of the original organizers of badminton were the military, the British military, when they were operating in India. And then Badminton Hall in England is where it took off in terms of organization. But the gentry, if you like, used to play that as an indoor sport, and there was quite a lot of badminton around. But they found when they went to play it outdoors, the wind was a big problem. And lo and behold, in December 1873, a Welshman, he was a Major Walter Clopton Wingfield, sat down and he worked out we could have a game that would be outdoors, it would be active, it would be suitable for male and female, and be competitive as well. And he produced a patented game in the early part of 1874. Now, that patented game involved a box set with nets, mallets, bats, balls, even line markers, I think. And within 1 year, now this is the phenomenal start of lawn tennis, within 1 year, that particular game took off everywhere. There was over 1,000 sets of his game sold in England, Ireland, over in America, and a lot of different countries around the world, Australia and so on. He called it Sparastika. And Sparastika is actually a Greek word for ball game. And on the box, he had the game of Sparastika or lawn tennis. Now, he wasn't the first person to come up with the term lawn tennis. A couple of years before that, there was an Englishman and a Spaniard tried out the game of lawn tennis on a court up near Birmingham, I think. And once Major Wingfield patented it, the game took off. So it happened a couple of years before, I think it was 1872, I think. And then lawn tennis took off literally like wildfire. At the end of 1874, he came up with this rules in the initial box sets, and then he reproduced it again at the end of the year. And at the end of the year, he not alone produced the rules, but also he produced all the quotes about this new game. And literally, the press all over the place were all fairly excited about this. We're talking about the gentry now, don't forget, people who had money. And I'm going to read very quickly from one of the press items that came up about this new game, and it sort of puts it into context. Sparrowsnica, or lawn tennis, the new rival to croquet, has been favourably reviewed by all the public journals. They declare that it is a clever adaptation of tennis, that it will become a national pastime, that no English home, no public grounds, no barrack square should be without it. We certainly wish it well, as it is felt that there's a sad want of a new game, croquet being declared by some too scientific, by others to be an insipid game, whilst the other candidate for public favour, badminton, cannot be played out of doors except in the stillest weather. And that's, if you like, summarizes why lawn tennis took off. An outdoor active game, and it was a replacement, if you like, for croquet. So you will notice when you look at the names of lawn tennis clubs around this country, never mind in England, that croquet was a big part of them. Like the Wimbledon club in Wimbledon is called Wimbledon Croquet and Lawn Tennis Club, because it was croquet that was played first. And in 1875, a year after this game was founded, they decided to put aside one of the croquet pitches for lawn tennis and for badminton. And then gradually, the game of lawn tennis, the rules and everything were all sanctioned, and the game started getting organized, if you like, and grew very, very fast. Now, that's, if you like, the origins of it. In Ireland, there was real tennis going way back. In fact, in 1610, I was just come across it. There was across the road, across the Liffey from the Four Courts, there's a Thomas Street. But off Thomas Street, there's actually a street called Tennis Court Lane. This is a 1610 map. So at that time, it was an indoor tennis court in Dublin, long before lawn tennis turned up. Now, when it comes to lawn tennis, the early clubs in 1877 were Lansdowne, which in fact was a club based on a sports club in Lansdowne. It was an athletic club, but they actually ended up having other sports, and they brought in tennis. So Lansdowne was one of the four originators, if you like. Lansdowne, Fitzwilliam, Monkstown, and Monkstown originated from an archery club, Limerick Lawn Tennis Club, and Trinity College. There were five actually, all started in the same year roughly, and the thing gradually got bigger and bigger and bigger, and more people played it. Now that's if you like the start of lawn tennis in Ireland. Now don't forget, in 1874, when Major Wingfield, or Walter Wingfield as his name was, when he sold his box sets, at the back of his little book, at the end of the year, he produced a long list of literally the elite of society who had bought a set. Now, it's a huge list, but he said he sold over 1,000 sets. But the Lords, the Prince of Wales, the Crown Prince of Prussia, the Grand Duke Tsarevich, the Duke of Edinburgh, earls, countesses, marquises, viscounts, lords, and ladies, and honourable gentlemen, and so on. And in the area, you can actually see various Irish names of people on this island who had actually bought the sets. So they're on their croquet lawns, anywhere you have a flat open space, this game of lawn tennis took off. And then people who were reasonably wealthy, who had a lawn anyway, they actually bought the sets. Ordinary people, business people possibly, and there was an awful lot of private courts were developed. In the years 1874 to 1877, you would have a scattering of courts around the country, and then the clubs then came into it.
Yeah. Who were some of those key people in organising tennis in the early days? You mentioned obviously the clubs that started. Who were some of those people that were key in tennis in Ireland in the early days?
In terms of organisation, the oldest tournament would have been the Limerick Lawn Tennis Club, which is now the South of Ireland Championships. They actually started literally 2 weeks after the first Wimbledon in 1877. They actually had a tournament there, and they had a ladies singles as well as a men's singles and men's doubles. And 1879, the Irish Championships were organised in Fitzwilliam Square by Fitzwilliam Lawn Tennis Club. Now, that was one of the big key developments, if you like, of lawn tennis in Ireland, because they had a fellow called Veer Gould and another fellow called Ernest Brown. They were two of the organisers. But then in comes a man called Colonel Arthur Henry Courtney. This Colonel Courtney was a big organiser, and he was affectionately known as the master, and he was involved in tennis development long before an Irish association was formed. Apparently, he was a great organiser. He got on very well. And when the visitors started coming across the water from England, they welcomed them, and he was highly thought of. And he ended up becoming, apart from being the club secretary for years, he ended up becoming the first president of the Irish Lawn Tennis Association later on. And in between, he was fighting the Boer War in South Africa. So this man was a busy man, but he was a great organizer by all counts. And then there were, in those days, there were a lot of sports writers, because if you look at the old newspapers, you'll find that there were sports writers specializing in events like tennis and badminton. And they used to describe, literally in detail, nearly every stroke that was played in competitions. And not alone that, but also describe the social side of it. As the Irish Championships, any social events in Dublin, it became as big as any of them. And it became an attraction. People came across from England from the second year onwards, and they enjoyed themselves because there was dances and all sorts of functions on every night, and the competition was only part of a much bigger event. People went to see it in Fitzwilliam Square, apart from getting involved in the actual playing of the sports themselves. So tennis in Dublin, among the English writers, not the Irish ones, but among the English writers, they actually said it's probably more enjoyable event than Wimbledon. That's what it came down to. And that lasted for quite a long time.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of organisers, later on, you would have the Irish Lawn Tennis Association, and then the various provinces come into it. But that sort of only gradually built up. In the early days, it was the organisers at Fitzwilliam that were the key people, getting things highlighted and motivated, and in the public eye, this is really some new sport that everybody can enjoy.
To move on a little bit, I guess, what can you tell us about those first Irish Championships that were held, as you said, in 1879?
The first Irish Championships were held in Fitzwilliam Square, and they held men's singles, men's doubles. Ladies singles came in 1879, but it was fairly unique to have ladies singles. The previous year, Limerick Lawn Tennis Club, when they started, they actually had ladies singles, so they actually made them to be the first open championship with ladies involved. Partly the reason is, in those days, their ladies didn't play sport. They were confined to playing croquet, and it was not the ladylike thing to do. And there were all sorts of issues going on for years. By doctors said that women shouldn't be playing sport and running around the court. And that's a sort of a nearly a separate social issue that evolved over the next 20 or 30 years. But nevertheless, the Irish Ladies Championship was held, and a woman called May Langrish from Kilkenny came up and won the championship. Herself and her sister actually won a big doubles tournament in the north of England. So don't forget, Wimbledon, we all focus on Wimbledon, but in England, there would have been big tournaments in different parts of down the coast or up near Manchester, Liverpool. There would have been a lot of different tournaments. So the north of England one was considered to be fairly prestigious. And it was before that any ladies doubles in Wimbledon, they had them in other locations. And the first one in the world was supposed to be the one in the Northern Championships, won by the Langrish sisters. And that was 1882. That was May Langrish who won the Irish Championships. And the inaugural winner of the men's singles was this man called Veer Thomas St. Ledger Gould. Now, I'm going to just intercept something at this point. In in the early days, a lot of people did not want to know that they were playing in these big tournaments. So they put in pseudonyms, all sorts of names. He called himself St. Ledger, this man originally from Waterford, who ended up getting a job in Dublin and being one of the main committee men, if you like, in Fitzwilliam. And he won this championship. Dear Thomas St. Ledger Gould. Now, that year he was expected to win Wimbledon, and he went over and played in Wimbledon, and he played against Reverend Hartley, and he lost that match because this Reverend Hartley was actually too steady for him, and it was a one-sided affair. This Reverend Hartley actually won it 2 years in a row. He won it in 1879 and 1880. Now, why Gould is significant is, now, by the way, before I leave Gould's tennis out of it, at the end of 1879, he went over and played in an autumn tournament in England, and he took the famous Willie Renshaw to 5 sets. Now, Renshaw may or may not have heard of him. There's 2 brothers, the Renshaw brothers, and between them they were mopping up titles year after year after year. They were that good. They were phenomenal players. So Gould wasn't a bad player at all. However, within a few years he got married. He lived in England for a while, and then he went to Canada. And at some stage or other, he decided, himself and his wife decided, we'll go to the south of France, because he had come up with an idea how to make money on the gambling casinos in Monaco, Monte Carlo. And over a period of time, himself and his wife got into financial bother. They got a loan of money and jewelry from some, I think it was a Danish woman. They ended up killing her because and then hid her body. So you had a man who was beaten by Reverend Hartley in the Wimbledon final, and he ended up in the courts in the south of France for murder, himself and his wife. Now, it's a long story. A fellow called Michael Sheridan actually has written a book called Murder in Monte Carlo. It became world news, this murder by this famous tennis player and his wife. The two of them were involved in it. He ended up dying. She died in France in prison, and he ended up dying in Devil's Island, which became a film called Papillon a number of years ago. It's based on the story of how he ended up dying there. And he was sort of, if you like, he went from one court to the other, a tennis court to a real court in France, and that was the end of his career.
And that is where we will leave episode 1. A big thanks to Tom for talking. Do join us again in episode 2, where we will be discussing the success of Irish players at the Grand Slams and the golden era of Irish tennis. I'm really looking forward to this next episode, so do tune in then again. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it around. I think it's really great to get to listen to Tom talking about this subject and getting so much information about the history of Irish tennis. I found this really, really interesting. Big thanks for listening to this episode, and we will see you again next time.